Okay, back to serial killers. So I know you've probably heard this term if you watch any kind of crime shows when the police talk about an offender's MO. So MO stands for modus operandi. And what it is a characteristic pattern of behavior repeated in a series of offenses that, this is the important part, it assists in the perpetration of the crime. So basically, it helps the offender get away with it. Okay, so here's some examples of MO. So let's say the offender, I want access to a large number of college-age women. Well, I'm going to choose to attack a college dormitory. I want, someone who I know is a stay-at-home mom, so I'm going to attack a family home. I've noticed that the homeowners, never lock their second-story window or their sliding glass doors, so that's where I'm going to enter. And I'm going to bring a toolkit with me. So if I need a box cutter to cut screens, if I need a pry bar to gain access, and then also paying attention to the time of day, okay? I know that the female is going to be home alone with the kids during the day. So that's when I'm going to attack because that has the greatest chance of me being successful. Okay, so the MO, yeah, it tends to be repeated. However, the MO will change over time because the offender is going to learn what doesn't and what does work, and they're going to work to improve so that they have a better chance of getting away with it. So, it's definitely going to evolve and change. Okay. Oh, here's some other examples. So MO is also anything that the perpetrator does to not leave evidence behind or to destroy evidence, whether it's, trying to clean up a scene with bleach to get rid of DNA, wearing gloves so they don't leave fingerprints. If they can take a certain type of vehicle to get to the crime scene. Hopefully this one doesn't happen much. I don't know. I know when I was in college or in graduate school, it was the first time I lived in an apartment. If someone knocked at the door and said, "Hey, I'm the exterminator. The landlord wanted me to come in," I'd let him in, no problem. I didn't know any better. So same with utility people. Hopefully people ask for a little more verification, or there's a communication via text or whatever, email that someone is going to be coming in. But back in the 80s, we didn't have those kinds of things. So the bug guy knocks on the door and it's like, well, come on in. Okay. So that could be an MO as well. So we're going to contrast that with what we refer to as the signature behavior or trademark behavior. And this is what you think of as, like the creepy, psychological, I guess, kind of calling card. Here's how it differs from MO. First of all, the signature or trademark does not change. Okay, it's something that is embedded into the psychology of the offender, and it's fulfilling some need for them, which is usually not obvious to investigators. It might be more obvious to people who are trained as profilers, but it's unusual, it's always repeated, and the biggest thing is it is not required to perpetrate the crime. So it doesn't help the person get away with it. I mean, the MO kind of makes sense, right? Because I don't want to get caught, so I'm going to do things to, and potentially change things so I don't get caught. The signature or trademark doesn't fit into that. Okay, it's always some type of psychological need for the offender. So the case example I want to give here is this guy right here on the lower left, whose name was Danny Rolling. And Danny Rolling was known as the Gainesville Ripper because he was killing people in Gainesville, Florida. And I don't have the exact count of who he killed. I encourage you to look that up. But his first victim was this young woman whose name was Krista Hoyt, or Christina Hoyt. I have to check on that. But Christina Hoyt was a young gal who she was going to school at Florida, and she was working in the Gainesville Police Department. as a clerk, I believe. And, just kind of a college job. But because she worked at the police department, the officers, the other employees who worked there, civilian staff, kind of saw her as, this is like my daughter, or it's my little sister, and they were very protective of her. Okay, Danny Rolling desperately wanted to be a police officer, and so he had applied to multiple academies and departments. No big surprise, was rejected by all of them. And it was usually because he failed the psychological aspect or the psychological test given to police officers, because he was a psychopath. And luckily they caught it. Well, that made him very, very angry. And so his first victim was this young woman. So he broke into her apartment and God, I have to look at more details. I'm sorry, I'm unprepared on this case. But he killed her, and I don't know if he sexually assaulted her as well. But what I remember, and I've seen these crime scene photos, and I still can't figure out how he did this. But he, after, post-mortem, thankfully, he decapitated her, and then he had her headless body sitting on the edge of her bed, like in a totally upright sitting position with her hands on, the front of her thighs. And so it looked just like a person sitting on the bed, but there's no head. Okay, I still don't know how he got her to stay upright in that position. He then took her head and put it on a bookshelf facing the front door. And the purpose for that was, I hate police departments because they won't hire me. I want the first responders or the first officers on the scene to have to walk in and see this horrific scene of the head of this woman who they basically thought of as their little sister or their daughter. And so that it would be especially psychologically damaging to the first responding officers. Okay. And that was why he did it. Okay. That's in his head. That is not, it certainly was not needed. Post-mortem mutilation is not needed to kill someone. But in his mind, the police needed to be punished because they wouldn't give him a job, basically. So here's some examples of signature or trademark behaviors. And the bottom line is that they're not needed to kill someone. Okay. Perpetrating rape against a person, that kind of fits into the element of torture. It's all about power and control, but, binding someone, overkill, which we've talked about, many times in class or seen it in videos. That's basically, an overexpression of violence beyond what needed to kill someone. Posing a body, usually done post-mortem, mutilation. For example, if an offender hates women, take that woman's body, have her naked and then maybe spread eagle laying out in a public place like a parking lot. And that would be basically, I want to shame you, and put you in this horrific, exposed position. Taking trophies or souvenirs, you probably have heard about this in your crime shows. So it can be anything from an earring, to a driver's license, to actual body parts. I had a case in Chicago, and I didn't work the case, but basically the victim's breasts had been removed. And so actual body parts can be taken as souvenirs. Foreign object insertions. So one thing you have to remember about these men, okay, and I'm talking specifically about the male offenders here. Once again, nothing against men, but that's what the statistics show. These guys are not normal people sexually, okay? Obviously, that's apparent from what they're doing, but what I mean is many times they can't get an erection. They cannot complete a sex act, and so if that's occurring, they may grab a foreign object and use that to penetrate the victim instead of, themselves. Also, one thing I want to point out here, and this is especially important for you, those of you going into law enforcement, don't assume that semen evidence is going to be found on the body or right around the body. There are some offenders that, looking at the body from a distance and then masturbating is where they get their thrill. And so, broaden your crime scene search. You may find semen evidence, 50 feet away from the body. Also, don't assume that if no semen is found, that it is not a sexually motivated crime. The offender, in his MO could use a condom and, remember to take the condom with them. And so you may not see any semen evidence, or they may not be able to function sexually. That could be especially apparent if you see foreign object insertion. Biting, gagging, torturing someone. Necrophilia, which the prefix necro always means dead. Philia means loving. So it's offenders that will have sexual contact with dead bodies. And I know you probably think, oh God, that doesn't happen. That is the stuff of horror films. No, unfortunately, it does happen. We're going to talk about cases with that. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer in Seattle, was especially known for necrophilia. Talk about having absolute power and control over someone. When they're dead, that's kind of absolute power and control. And for some of these offenders, that's what gets them worked up. Sorry for this graphic discussion, but hey, it's true. Just to summarize, the signature and trademark behaviors are the creepy weirdo card. They don't change over time, and they are important to the offender, but not usually, may not be apparent to people investigating the crime. Whereas the MO, it makes sense, all right? It's going to help the offender get away with the crime, and it can change over time. Okay, so let me show you some examples of signature or trademark behaviors. So Ted Bundy, and we'll talk about him more a little later, he always chose women that had long brown or light brown hair parted in the middle, which was kind of the popular style that was in the 1970s. We'll talk about why he did that a little later. Gary Ridgway, as I mentioned, he always chose prostitutes, or let me update my language there, sex workers. And he would frequently return to the bodies of the women that he had murdered and have sex with them. And in fact, during his interrogation, he actually bragged about this to detectives about, look at how smart I am. I am saving so much money on, my prostitution costs by going back to the bodies and just having sex with them. And he would literally have sex with them until they were too decomposed to do so. And, being through our death investigation unit, you know what we're talking about when when I mention advanced decomp. So that kind of, illustrates how depraved he was. This guy on the right, you probably haven't heard of. He was in Texas, didn't really make the national news because he didn't have as many victims. But one thing that the medical examiner would notice on autopsy is that he had enucleated all of his victims. And that is the term that means to remove eyeballs. Now, once again, thankfully, these were, the enucleation was done post-mortem, thank God. So a couple of things that I want to bring up. First of all, the reason you don't hear about a lot of serial offenders is they target sex workers. And that is actually a very, very smart victim choice, because many women who work as sex workers do so because it's a way to survive. They, may be homeless. They may have a drug addiction problem and they have to feed that addiction some way. And so they turn to sex work because of that. Often they are mentally ill. They may be disenfranchised from their families. So their family's not going to know to put in a missing persons report or even care enough to, because, the victim doesn't associate with the family and vice versa. So that's why you don't hear a lot about these offenders, because unfortunately in our society, people tend to look at sex workers as, well, hey, you're out there doing prostitution. You kind of deserve what you get. And, people, kind of don't care about it. It's almost like kind of like a blame the victim. Now, yes, okay, prostitution is illegal in the United States. Some people choose to go into sex work because they want to. Okay, good, good for you. Have at it. But a lot of women are trafficked, or they end up doing sex work not because they want to, but because they have to survive. They're still victims. And one of the things that I really appreciated when I worked at the crime lab in Chicago was, I have to say, every single detective that I worked with busted their butt on dead sex worker cases, okay? They didn't look at them as any less of a victim. They worked really hard on those cases. Now, hard to solve because, as I said, perfect victims, especially for serial offenders. But that's one thing I really, appreciated about the Chicago Police Department was that. Okay, the other thing I want to mention, and we'll talk a little bit about profiling, and what makes a profiler. So there's a lot of people out there calling themselves profilers that are not profilers. So we'll talk about how you can tell if someone is the real deal or not. But my point is, when profilers, or I'm not sure if it was a forensic psychiatrist, interviewed Charles Albright, they asked him, why did you remove the victim's eyes? And I think when we think about profiling, we want there to be these big, significant reasons behind, why these offenders do what they do. It seems like when you watch Criminal Minds, there's always, he hated his mother, or there was, there's something in their past. So, for Charles Albright, was it, the eyes are the windows of the soul? Is that why you wanted to take them as trophies? Was it because you thought that, you wanted to preserve the fact that you were the last person that this victim saw before you killed them? Was it some, big, thing like that? And his response was, I just thought they looked cool, and I put them in a jar. Okay, so sometimes these offenders do what they do just because they do it. And I actually heard about the Charles Albright case at a presentation that was given by an FBI trained profiler. And her point was, people want profilers to be able to tell us exactly why people are doing what they're doing, because it makes them feel better. It makes society feel better. And sometimes it just doesn't work that way. Sometimes these offenders just do what they do because they do it. And there's really no way to predict it. It's within their own mind. And that's what makes it a signature or trademark behavior. Okay, so to summarize, the difference between MO and signature or trademark behavior, let me give you this example. Okay, so let's say we have, a victim that's a victim of a homicide, and the offender pours gasoline all over the body and sets it on fire. So if this is an MO behavior, the purpose of that behavior is to try to maybe destroy evidence that's on the body. It may also be, I want to buy time because there's, it's going to take longer for them to identify the body, whether they can do it through dental records or fingerprints or DNA, but it's going to buy me some time. So that makes sense, okay? That person is doing this to try to be successful and to get away with it. If that were a signature or trademark behavior, it'd be, I'd like to see a body burn. I just want to see flesh burn, and that's within their own brain. So that is the difference between those two. Okay, so we're going to start here in my next video because I know we're almost up to about 20 minutes. YouTube's been going really slow, but, hopefully this will be uploaded later today. All right, thanks you guys.